Hey there everybody, Sage Popham here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. And the other day I did one of our quarterly live Q&A sessions for all of the Evolutionary Herbalism students. And someone asked a question about how do we go about holistically treating influenza? And, we're here, it's December of 2019, and as I'm sure you know, this tends to be the season where people are coming down with the flu, or people are getting colds, you got compromised immune systems, there's all sorts of bugs floating around in the air. And so I thought it would be really fun to share some of the content that I taught during that Q&A webinar. So, one of the reasons why I think this is particularly important is because, it's really conventional for people when they get the flu and especially with the accompanying fever, for people to really reach for, taking something like aspirin to get that fever down. And, one of the things that we see is that when we suppress a fever, we actually end up prolonging the sickness there, right? We can turn what would normally be maybe a 2-3 day fever into a week-long fever through suppressing it. And, one of the wonderful things about herbal medicine is that we have plants available to us that really support the body in going about its natural response in the way the body reacts to a fever, and the way that I think it's important for us as herbalists to remember that there is a vital intelligence in the body, right? In the West, we oftentimes refer to that as the vital force. And as holistic herbalists, we want to really make sure that we're always honoring and following that flow of the vital force, trusting in the intelligence of the body, trusting in the fact that our bodies know how to self-regulate and to self-heal, and that our work with plants is really just supporting that process rather than, biochemically overriding what our body is trying to do in order to auto-regulate and auto-self-heal. So I thought this was a very fitting discussion to be sharing here in the late autumn, transitioning into winter time. So I just wanted to do a little introduction here, and I hope you enjoy some of the teachings that I shared here in our Evolutionary Herbalism quarterly webinar. And so we're going to be talking a little bit here about some of my approaches to holistically addressing influenza and fever. All right, what is my protocol for the flu? Well, there's a handful of things that I generally consider here in the treatment of the flu. And I think before really getting into that, I think it's worth kind of acknowledging an interesting kind of dynamic in our terminology, where we tend to lump colds in with flus, right? We always say colds and flus, maybe because people tend to get them around the fall and winter time. Maybe that's why. But really from a perspective of pathology, they're actually quite different in the sense that, they have similarities and they have differences. They're generally both viral infections affecting the respiratory system. But one of the big differences is that, the common cold generally affects upper respiratory, right? Sinuses, you get the stuffy nose, the kind of, your head feels like it's floating on a balloon 10 feet above your head, kind of tired, sluggish, sometimes a sore throat. That generally is about the extent of it, right? Whereas a fever, this is typically, yes, can be upper respiratory, but oftentimes flus tend to get much deeper into the respiratory system. So we oftentimes see a cough, oftentimes associated with some bronchitis. But the main differentiating factor is fever, right? And so influenza infection, generally speaking, always is accompanied by a fever whereas a common cold is not. So that's a really important distinguishing factor here, and really kind of changes the approach to effectively treating the flu. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that, no one has ever died from the common cold, but people die every year from influenza. Generally, it's usually young children or, the elderly, people that really don't have very strong immune systems, strong vitality. But nonetheless, people do die from the flu quite often. Not to mention, every now and then there are these really big flu pandemics that come out, and it can be very difficult to treat, etc. So just wanted to give a little background there. When it does come to actual, herbal treatment for the flu, there's a number of factors that I think are important to consider. First is food, actually. So an old kind of rule of thumb is that you fast a fever and feed a cold. So this is why during a cold, it's nice to have a lot of hot soups and broth, and you want to keep yourself nourished during a cold. But during a fever, actually eating food is not good. Which, generally speaking, when someone has a working fever, usually they don't really have that much of an appetite anyway, but it's good to keep that person in a fasting state. The reason for that is that during a fever, all of the blood is being pushed out to the periphery and is being circulated to, circulate immunological components, to keep things moving, to try to push heat out, and ultimately raise the internal body temperature to cook out that pathogen. When you eat a meal, all of your blood has to flow back into the digestive system. And so that can really inhibit the process of a fever in pretty detrimental ways. So I always say fast a fever, feed a cold. And the other important thing before I get into kind of practical aspects of how I go about treating it is that it's very important to understand is that a fever is a vital response. This is an intelligent response of the vital force of the body in response to a pathogen. And so, from an allopathic perspective, we see the fever as the enemy. From a vitalist perspective, we see that the fever is the friend, and it's actually the intelligence of the body at work fighting off this invading pathogen. And so it's really important that we, as vitalists, we work with the vital force, that we move with that intelligence of the body and don't suppress it or try to, biochemically, so to speak, shut it off, which is essentially what a lot of our over-the-counter kind of fever-reducing, or what we would call a febrifuge type drugs do. Aspirin, ibuprofen, things like that. Those non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they work amazing, but they, turn off that fever response, biochemically speaking. And, if you think of it, the fever is the body's innate way of basically raising the internal temperature, so it'll denature those, whatever the pathogen is. And so if you shut that down for however many hours, during that downtime where the fever is not active, sure, you feel better because you don't have a fever, because a fever doesn't make you feel good, right? But during that time, that pathogen is reproducing. And so the suppression of the fever is going to significantly extend the period of time one is sick than a fever that's just allowed to do its job. Now, from an herbal standpoint, as I said, we want to support the vital force. We want to support the body. We want to encourage what the body's already trying to do with our plants. And this is why we have this amazing category of remedies referred to as diaphoretics. And the diaphoretics it's a really cool category of herbs because they are used to treat a fever, and they do so very successfully, but they're not suppressing it. They're actually helping the fever to do its job. And they do this through a couple different ways. And there's really, I think, of two subcategories of diaphoretics. So on the one hand, we have our stimulant diaphoretics. These are pungent, hot, warming, circulatory stimulating type plants that are gonna, again, help increase that temperature. And so really anything that tastes particularly spicy and makes you sweat, that is a stimulant diaphoretic. So all of our really hot, spicy peppers, herbally, like cayenne is a big one here, very powerful stimulant diaphoretic. Ginger, even black pepper, these are all stimulant diaphoretics. Really anything that's gonna move the blood, bring the blood up to the surface. Now, the stimulant diaphoretics are really used oftentimes during an earlier phase of a fever. So generally when someone feels cold, and this is because the hypothalamus has set your basal body temperature from its baseline, like whatever, 98.6 or whatever it might be. It's saying, okay, instead of 98.6 is standard, 104 is standard, or 102 or 103 or whatever it is. But so that's baseline, but you're still at 98 something, and so you feel cold, right? So you get kind of pale skin, low energy, you feel shivery, you feel cold, and this is when you want to give a stimulant diaphoretic. The other type is the relaxant diaphoretics, and these are remedies that are typically used later on in a fever when the fever's kind of peaking, when you feel hot, your skin's red, the skin's dry. Oftentimes there's a lot of tension, both psychological and also physiological, in the sense that your muscles start to get a little achy, your back hurts, your head hurts, everything feels kind of tight, you're having a hard time sleeping, and you feel hot, right? This is where we use relaxant diaphoretics. And what these are doing is they're actually relaxing constriction in the capillary beds just under the skin, as well as the pores of the skin. So I always say a relaxant diaphoretic, it's like if you close all the windows in a room and crank the heat up, and that room gets really, really hot. Well, a stimulant diaphoretic is like turning the heat up. A relaxant diaphoretic is like opening up the windows, right? And so that's really what those remedies are doing. They're opening up the pores, opening up the capillary beds, so all that internal heat can release and ultimately break that fever. Classic remedies here would be lobelia, pleurisy root, bone set is a major remedy here. Peppermint, elderflower, yarrow, some of those have mixed stimulant and relaxant diaphoretic properties, especially like yarrow, I find is kind of working in both ways. So these are some really great remedies to consider working with in treating the fever side of influenza. Now, the last part I want to say about diaphoretics is that it's really important that these are drank as hot teas. That is really what brings out that diaphoretic property much more, as that hot tea. Taking a tincture, it'll work, but not that well. If you only have a tincture, and there's been a lot of situations where I've had to treat fevers and all I have is tincture, what I'll usually do is boil some water or just get some hot water, not just like hot out of the faucet, but like tea drinking hot, and I'll put the tincture in there and just have someone drink that. And because, think of it, hot water, what does it do? It volatilizes, it steams, it moves up and out. And that's the whole energy of a fever. It's the whole energy of a diaphoretic, because we're pushing things up and radiating things out. It's like that fire element, right? We're pushing up and out. So diaphoretics. The other element of this is, I just want to kind of spotlight on bone set a little bit here. Bone set is a very, very important influenza remedy. I think it's the most important influenza remedy. It has antiviral properties, which of course is beneficial, but it is an incredibly reliable relaxant diaphoretic. specifically for the deep aches and pains in the muscles and in the bones during a fever. Bone set is very specific for that, and it works very, very well. So I just want to mention bone set. That's Eupatorium perfoliatum, must-have remedy for the treatment of influenza. The other aspect of this here is, working with antiviral plants. That's not always the way I think about it. But if someone has, for example, an accompanying cough with influenza, which is really common, we want to give indicated expectorants and respiratory route antiviral remedies to just support the body in clearing out that pathogen. Some of my tops here would be Lomatium dissectum, OSHA or Ligusticum porteri, licorice, great remedy here. Hyssop is excellent. Thyme and oregano, really, really great, but really very broad spectrum. And the other remedy that I really like here is poplar buds. That resinous bud from poplar trees that's got that resin. You usually pick them, depending on where you live, like January-ish. Makes a really resinous tincture that's very broad spectrum. Usnea lichen is actually another really great remedy here. So of course we want to make sure that we're, giving remedies that are indicated for the tissue state of that respiratory system though, right? So, if it's really hot and dry, maybe giving them OSHA isn't the best way to go, right? And if you do give OSHA, you got to give it with moistening and cooling herbs to balance out the energetics. So always making sure to attend to the energetics. The other thing that I really like giving people during fever is nervines. If they're losing sleep, if they're having a lot of muscle tension and muscle pain, sometimes I'll give someone a really heavy dose of some herbs to just knock them out, right? If someone's up all night, they're, with fever, they're having a real hard time sleeping at night, that is an obstacle to cure, right? Because the body is rejuvenating and replenishing itself during sleep. So I want to make sure people are sleeping really well. So if needed, I will sometimes administer a heavy-hitting nervine like valerian or passion flower or hops or something, just to relax someone, maybe relax their muscles a little bit and just get them to sleep. That can be really helpful too. And of course, the last thing is water, water, water. We got to make sure people are staying very hydrated during a fever as they're sweating a lot and they're losing a lot of fluids. So we got to make sure they stay hydrated. Administering electrolytes can be really helpful if they're really, really sweating a lot and, especially getting a lot of that muscle pain. Electrolytes really helpful there. I really like giving people some magnesium too. That can be helpful to provide some relief. And unless it's getting dangerously high, I really just like to support things with diaphoretics and kind of some of those things that I mentioned, and then just kind of let the body run its course. Usually doing something like that, fever will be taken care of within a day or two. And the thing about that too is that you're going to emerge on the other side stronger, right? Your immunity's stronger, your body's stronger. Ultimately, you're healthier than you are if you just take an antibiotic, which, by the way, an antibiotic is for bacteria, and these are viral infections, so they usually don't work so well, if at all. But for some reason, doctors still give them, which doesn't make any sense to me. Or if you're taking like aspirin or something, that also is really suppressive, and you're not giving your immune system an opportunity to learn. So really, every time that you get sick like that, and support the body with herbs, follow the vital force, allow the body to just do its job, you will emerge on the other side healthier and stronger and ultimately more vital. And that's really what we're going for in a vitalist orientation of herbal medicine, is not just curing disease or fixing what's broken, but really doing things in a way that people are ultimately strengthening their overall vitality, which translates into a longer, happier, healthier life.